Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. As you guys know, I am an evangelical, but I love Bishop Barron. Now, what's interesting is I want to do a few videos on Bishop Barron talking about Protestant reformational ideas and persons. In this case, I want to show you a clip of Bishop Barron on Martin Luther. I went and studied, my master's degree was in theology, and I got to study Martin Luther a lot. And so it'll be interesting to see what Bishop Barron has to say here. So let's check out what he has to say.
Well, with the great profit and pleasure, I've been reading recently Alec Ryrie's new book called Protestants, the Faith That Made the Modern World. A lot of books are coming out now because it's the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Reformation. And I've been reading a number of them, and I think his book stands out for its lucidity and its verve and its energy. In some ways, it reminded me of Brad Gregory's book, The Unintended Reformation, and Gregory looking at it more from the Catholic side, Ryrie from the Protestant side. What I most appreciated, though, is toward the beginning of his book, is his portrait of the undisputed founder of the Protestant movement, namely Martin Luther. Now, I'll confess to a certain fascination with Luther over many years. I started reading him probably when I was in college. I've read a lot of his books and articles and sermons, etc. And then for about 10 years, when I was a teacher at Mundelein Seminary, I taught a course, kind of a graduate level course in the theology of the 16th century, which involved reading an awful lot of Luther. Say what you want about Martin Luther, he's one of the most beguiling figures of the time. I mean, he was cantankerous, he was pious, he was brilliant, he was deeply anti-Semitic, he was wonderful, and he was exasperating, I mean, all at the same time. Why people keep coming back to Luther with a certain fascination. The other thing, too, his writings, even though I disagree with massive amounts of what Luther says, it's hard not to like his literary style. He's one of the rare people from the time of Augustine on who's able to write in Latin with an awful lot of verve and energy. His works kind of crackle when you read them. So anyway, Luther, I've been fascinated by for a long time. Well, Ryrie sort of prompted me to squint at Luther in a somewhat new way, looking at Luther with fresh eyes. He uses the categories of fighter and lover. You know, Luther quite obviously was a fighter. Look, he took on the Roman Curia, he took on the Pope, he took on the Emperor, took on the electors of the Holy Roman Empire, he took on the Inquisitors, etc., etc. Luther was a very pugnacious figure. And there's no doubt that he bequeathed to Protestantism this fighting spirit. I mean, from Zwingli and Calvin all the way through Karl Barth, you can see this sort of, protesting side of Protestantism. So that's true. But Ryrie insists, and I think he's right about this, that that's only to see a comparatively small part of the picture. Because Luther was also, and primarily, a lover. And what he means here is he's somebody who fell in love radically with God. So we know the story well, that Luther, the pious Augustinian monk, after many, many years of striving through all sorts of spiritual exercise and moral excellence to be pleasing to a just and demanding God, in the famous Turmerlebnis, the Germans call it the tower experience, Luther felt this breakthrough of grace, that he's justified not by his own heroic effort, but by the sheer grace of God, accepted as a gift in faith. And this was mediated to him by the Bible, the great text, especially of St. Paul. So Luther fell radically in love with the God who had radically expressed his love for him. And there's the heart, if you want, even the mystical heart of Protestantism. Now, trace that as well, from everyone from John Wesley through Schleiermacher all the way up to contemporary times. You can see this, call it mystical, affective dimension of Protestantism. Now, here's why I say this caused me to squint at Luther in a new way. Because I'll use another standard set of categories. Often religious experience is analyzed according to either the mystical or the prophetic, right? So mystical is experiential. It's often the kind of priestly, sacramental side of things. Then there's the prophetic, which is very word-oriented, it's challenging, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in almost all the characterizations, Luther falls on the prophetic side of that divide. And indeed, you can find a lot of things in Luther to justify just that move. But Ryrie prompted me to think, I don't know, maybe that's not really adequate to it. That if anything, Luther falls on this more mystical, the lover side of the equation, you know? Now, why do I say that helped me to see it differently? Well, think about someone now who's in love, who's fallen in love. What do they do and what do they sound like? Well, consult the high romantic poets or consult even a teenager talking about his first crush. They tend to use words like forever and only and always, you know, something that's over the top, that's exaggerated in the speech of people who have fallen in love. And if I might bring this up to date, look at my great hero, the Nobel laureate Bob Dylan, who's a distant spiritual descendant, if you want, of Martin Luther, because in the late 70s, Bob Dylan becomes an evangelical Christian. He writes a song not long after his conversion called Saving Grace. It's a lovely song and includes the line, I look around this old world and all that I'm finding is the saving grace that's over me. Now, mind you, this is the same Bob Dylan who a handful of years before had talked about Desolation Row, who had talked about unmasking the executioners, who had talked about pellets of poison flooding our waters, and so on and so forth. This is a sharply, prophetically critical Bob Dylan, who in the wake of his own experience of grace can say, all that I'm finding, all that I see is the saving grace that's over me. That's the way people in love sound. Now listen to Martin Luther. The great solas, the three solas of the Reformation, right? Sola fide, by faith alone. Gratia sola, by grace alone. Scriptura sola, by the Bible alone. Well, what is that but the sort of excessive, extravagant, over-the-top expression of a powerful mystical experience? Now, does that hold up to strict scrutiny? No, I would say. Is it in line? Is it expressive of an experience? Yeah, powerfully so. Correct in the strict sense? No. Of course not, I would say. Now, here's my point. Can we look at Luther's great statement, the solas of the Reformation, and say, yeah, good, right, in the measure that it expresses this experience of grace? And at the same time, can we look at the Council of Trent, which offers a sharp theological correction, I would say, of Luther's language? Trent that looks now at the relationship between faith and works, between grace and our effort, et cetera, in a much more careful manner. And can we say, yeah, that's right? And I just wonder, I'm just kind of speculating here, is whether saying yes to both those things might actually represent a step forward in the ecumenical conversation.
I think that is a perfect summary of what Bishop Barron is ultimately getting at in this kind of deep dive or analysis of Martin Luther from a fresh perspective. It really is a shocking perspective when you think about how history has painted Martin Luther as kind of this very, very sharp individual, and to see him kind of in this soft perspective, I think is ultimately helpful. Now, what I think is ultimately going on here is Bishop Barron is trying to paint Martin Luther less from what actually Luther has written, what has kind of come from Luther in the Protestant Reformation, and the sharp view, I'm just going to use that term, sharp view, really comes back to what Martin Luther has written. What, not necessarily who he is in his persona, but what he is on paper in his words. And so I do think that this recoloring of Luther, trying to ground him in the milieu of Romanticism, Reformation, Renaissance, all of that, humanism, all of those different kind of strands that are influencing society at that time, I do think it is actually helpful to make sense of who he is. And if that means you can repaint him in a mystical way that aligns more to the Wesleys of the world, as Bishop Barron is talking here, that will allow for a more ecumenical dialogue, because, obviously Wesley is much more Anglican, high liturgical church. He also doesn't have such a sharp distinction as Luther does of law and gospel in his writings. And so it allows for I guess I'll use C.S. Lewis's term, a mere Christianity that looks more like the historical one, rather than this kind of gigantic chasm that seems to exist between much of Protestant Reformational theology and much of the historical church. Very, very fascinating clip. I do think that Bishop Barron's take on Martin Luther, what I love about Bishop Barron is that he's so he knows how to walk the fine line. And I just absolutely love that about Bishop Barron. And it's why I'll continue to listen to Bishop Barron and heed information and wisdom from him, because he's such an influential and insightful interpreter, not only of the Bible, not only of the church, not only of theology, but as we see in this video, history. Hope you enjoyed this video. Remember that Christianity is Christ, and without Christ there is no Christianity. We'll see you in the next one. Peace.